So the point that the Zohar is trying to make here is, yes, there may be many names of God, many aspects of God, but they're really all one. Because that's why it says, the entire Torah is one name of the Holy One, an exalted name, a name that includes all the other names. So there has to be one name that contains the entirety of what all of this kind of inter-divine communication and this variety of the divine names shouldn't in any way diminish the oneness. So, I mean, the truth is, philosophically, you can argue back and forth, but what does that mean? If there are many, then there's not one. If there's one, then there's not many. So, make up your mind. I think the idea is that the Zohar is very into the dynamism, the dynamic interplay between God and himself, between God and the world, between us and God. And therefore, the idea of first of all, it's interesting because these are the very things that, I hate to use the competition to Judaism kind of attacks us with, are the same things that the Zohar embraces and totally understands them in a different way. I'll give you 2 examples. I'll give you 3 examples. So many people want to say that the reason why there are different names of God in the Torah is simply because there were competing deities already in existence. They weren't really one God. And Judaism wasn't really a belief system in one God. It was taking competing gods and making a new religion out of it. That's one theory, popular theory. Okay. Here's another one. There are various biblical authors. Again, God forbid.
It's not that I don't want to see things exactly as me.
Who is this woman competing with me? What?
One has a mind of its own.
Where are we holding?
Another theory about the
another theory of the Bible having authors, authors, and one of the ways that people want to put forth as some supposed proof to this is that different sections of the Torah emphasize different names, and that must be because the various supposed authors had they had their names, so therefore, again, so a third thing, not so much a theory, but a critique of Judaism, an anti-Judaic critique that was put forth primarily by Christianity, is the supposed God of the Old Testament as an angry God, a God who is full of vengeance, full of hatred, full of vindictiveness. Okay? How does the Zohar look at these 3 things? So the first is that Judaism believes in a dynamic God. And the reason why there are different names for God is because there are different energies. And guess what? There's even negative energies. Now, we wouldn't say one of the names of God is a negative thing, but even some negative aspects of the Torah have something to do. We'll get back to what the negativity is in the Zohar. Spiritual negativity and other things. So the response to the first thing of there being many gods, the Zohar is ready to embrace many aspects of one God. And that's why the Zohar here is clearly stating there are many names of God, but ultimately are one. So we read the Torah with a cohesiveness, which then explains the second question. The challenge, one of the challenges that biblical critics have made against the idea of the Bible being authored in some form or another by God, whether you call Moses being God's messenger or what have you, but the idea that one person wrote the 5 books of Moses, or everything but, let's say, the last couple verses, something to that effect, and he was a scribe or a prophet, or combination of scribe of prophet of God, which is how the rabbis see the 5 books of Moses. The first 4 being like a scribe, and the 5th book being like a prophet. Comes the Zohar and says, no, these different names of God that we see, some more emphasized in different sections than others, are not because they're different biblical authors, but because in different situations, different energies of the different aspects of God are more manifest. One aspect of God is more manifest consistently in the service of the temple. The Zohar is right away picks up on that very much. In other sections, in the section of Genesis, another name of God is manifest that for its specific reason. The Zohar picks up on these things and illuminates and elucidates and explains them. So that's the second thing. The third thing, which is the Christian, mostly the Christian polemic against Judaism, the Zohar addresses directly. I'm not saying directly like it says, and maybe not that directly, but pretty. I'll quote the Zohar on this. This Zohar is in Parshas Hazinu, the last parsha of the Torah. If somebody could grab me a chumash, I could read you some of the things in Hazinu are right behind you.
I wanted to ask to clarify. I'll use this minute in the meantime. I don't understand what you're saying that the Zohar is adding, because it seems usually the interpretation given is that God manifests to us in different ways, and how we perceive God's manifestation in the world could sometimes be the God of, like, as justice, or the God of mercy, or the God of this. So that the names are really reflections of how we perceive.
The Zohar didn't create this idea, right, but the Zohar takes it to a new level.
Right. So the
Chazal already acknowledge it. Not you're obviously correct. What the Zohar does is it classifies almost every name of God and explains why in that context that name of God is used. Not all the time, but for many, many, many times.
It sounded almost in the beginning as though you're saying that it embraces the view of something that actually shatters the unity in a sense, in other words, beyond only our perception.
Well, put it this way: there have been. You see, there's a lot of academics who want to say, for the sake of what I think excitement, so to have something to say, is that when the Zohar says it's really all one, it doesn't really mean it. Like when it talks about the variety of God's names, that's the part we have to, embrace. So, and there are a few things that if you read them independently might sound like they're different aspects of God. They truly are separated somehow or not unified. So you have to decide whether or not you want to trust the Zohar when it itself says that there really ultimately is only one God, whether you want to trust it, or do you want to say, well, there's other religions who also say the same thing. They believe in many gods, but they say ultimately there's one God, so maybe that's Judaism. So there are going to be people who are going to argue that. In fact, Shalom quotes an author, I don't remember his name because Shalom utterly just dismisses him, that has written an essay on how the Zohar is a book that believes in more than one God.
Gershon Shalom?
Shalom quotes somebody before him who wrote such an essay, which he dismisses offhand, which he's not really impressed with. So again, obviously there's some people who they're going to take it upon themselves to take certain parts of the Zohar at face value and then ignore the other parts. And then and the parts that they take at face value, they're going to expand on their kind of radicalism.
Is it an intermediate level? Like, in other words, it's not only our faulty perception that sees it this way, but that actually God's unity manifests itself in a fractured way according to these names.
That's, what I think you're saying is, could it be that we actually, it isn't really disconnected, but you could see it as being disconnected. That could be, but
is it wrong to think simplistically that God contains all those midos, all those attributes, and individual attributes are emphasized in different situations? Is that too simplistic?
Now, there's nothing wrong with that.
What's against Rambam?
Not at all.
Have positive attributes.
No. The attributes.
Because he means it via negativa, that you can only really talk about God
right. That's
by what he doesn't possess.
I'm talking about the mitos of God,
Yeah.
not the negative.
I thought he was saying like, because the Rambam was a misnagid, so he didn't have any
Not at
positive.
all. No, that's that
God
God.
forbid.
You can't say how
He was a
powerful
chassid.
God is the power of God is the absence of
But again,
imitatives.
those midas would be again how he perceives God.
No,
As a unity.
mitos.
God
This is how God
doesn't-
is projecting rachamim here.
Right, exactly.
Yud Kei Vav Kei is projecting rachamim.
Anyway,
And
let's get
God
back
is
to the Zohar itself. The Zohar in its own
But he
words.
doesn't use those words, mitos. The Zohar does not use
The Zohar does, but
It does.
at some points. But it's much more than that in the Zohar. It's not just there's different midos. It's way beyond that. But this is the Zohar in Parshas Yisro. No, I'm sorry. This is the Zohar in Parshas Hazino. Thank you. And if anybody wants to look it up, it's in the way the Zohar works. Is there's 3 original volumes of the Zohar. So there's called Chelik Aleph, Chelik Beis, and Chelik Gimel. First volume, which is Bereshis. The second volume is Shemos, Sefer Shemos, and the third volume is Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, altogether. So that's why one of the great things about having like the original Aramaic Zohar in 1 or 3 volumes is you literally look up. If it's in volume 2, you look up. We just did it. Kuf Chav Dalid in Amid Beis. Okay, you look it up. It's there. It's easy enough to find. Even in more complicated editions with 15 or 20 volumes, you still should have, any decent Zohar should have the daf on it, should have the page in it, so you can be able to look it up. So anyway, this is a Zohar on page 318b in Hazino. If you want to look it up, and you get to that level, you'll get there eventually. And and there it's talking about, one of the things it's talking about is sections that are talking about tochacha, rebuke. So it says, even the rebuke of the Torah to Israel is part of the divine name. In other words, again, even though we already said the entire Torah is the divine name, but even more specifically, the sections that are kind of negative, vengeful, angry, all of the kind of things that people say that the God of the Old Testament, this kind of like, when you read, see, that's interesting, because I do read books of other religions, including Christianity, and how they kind of critique Judaism. And they describe, the truth is they're quoting verses in the Torah, and I'm like, what are they talking about? What are these people talking about? Because they don't have Medrash, they don't have the Gemara, they don't have the Zohar. So in a sense, their simplicity of their kind of literal thinking, they don't have Torah Sheba'al Peh, in short. So without Torah Sheba'al Peh, so they need Jesus. I'm just saying, like, sure they need him, because their interpretation of the Tanakh without the Chazal is totally lacking. We totally don't believe their version. We have the same thing. It's the same book. So it's like, they say Lahavdil, there's a New Testament and an Old Testament. We don't say that. We say there's the oral Torah, there's the written Torah and the oral Torah. But without the oral Torah, you can't just read the Chumash. And by the way, today Jews do the same thing. They read the Torah like Christians.